You're interrupting the momentum, Marcus said, slicing through my sentence like a paper shredder through last quarter's regrets. We were on the quarterly finance prep call, just the core team, and he made damn sure to humiliate me in high definition. I'd barely said the words vendor reconciliation schema before his hands flew up like I'd just recited poetry at a budget meeting. We're not here to debate hypotheticals, Rachel. He smirked, voice dripping with the kind of condescension that only comes from a man who's never been told no. The other analysts stared at their screens, silent witnesses to another corporate drive-by. I muted my mic, smiled like it didn't sting, and let the silence do the bleeding. Marcus had joined the company 2 months ago, fresh from some VC-funded consulting startup with a ping-pong table and delusions of grandeur. He strutted into every meeting with buzzwords loaded like ammo: velocity, synergy, scalable frameworks, and somehow the executive team, exhausted from a brutal year of missed projections, bought every word. My role? Compliance and risk. 6 years in, I was the reason our company had never been fined, sued, or dragged through the headlines. My fingerprints were on every vendor protocol, every payment flow, every clause in our lender covenants. I knew those agreements better than I knew my own reflection. That's why Marcus's brilliant idea to restructure vendor classifications wasn't optimization. It was a slow-motion disaster. Our primary lender had strict thresholds for capital versus operational expenditures. 1 decimal in the wrong column could trigger a $5 million covenant breach, and Marcus was about to play Jenga with live wires. But no one wanted to hear it, least of all him. After the meeting, Slack buzzed like a wasp nest. Marcus dropped a meme of a fortune teller with the caption, "Compliance. Cassandra predicts doom again," followed by, "Somebody get her a crystal ball." The junior analysts reacted with laughing emojis. One even tagged me. "She's just passionate." I didn't respond. I screenshotted it instead. It went into a folder I'd started 3 weeks prior, tucked between payroll reports and my notarized job scope. The folder's name? Professional Distance. Because after years in compliance, I'd learned one thing: paper doesn't blink. 2 days later, I logged in to check the shared ledger and found my edit access gone. The changelog said revoked by M. Thompson at 6:43 p.m. the night after that prep call. No explanation, just silence. I sent Marcus a message. "Hey, I've lost access to Q3 ledgers. Intentional?" He replied almost instantly. "Streamlining, reducing redundancy. You're still looped on protocols." The emoji was the insult. He'd just cut me out of the system I built and thought a smiley face made it fine. The next morning, payroll pinged me, wanted me to start tracking hours in 15-minute increments for accuracy. I'd seen that move before. It's how companies start their paper trail when they're prepping to push someone out. Every HR training I'd ever conducted flashed in my head like a slow-motion car crash. So I played along. I smiled, logged every minute, pretended not to see the knife. That lunch, I drove to a UPS store near a gas station and drafted a memo. Clean, clinical, factual. It documented how Marcus's team had reused the Q2 vendor classification template without updating for July's new payment splits. I cited Clause 5.2b of our lender agreement, the one that said capital outflows exceeding 18% quarter over quarter without depreciation disclosures constituted a covenant breach. Our new classification put us at 22.4%. The memo listed file names, timestamps, and screenshots, all notarized that same hour by a woman named Linda who didn't ask questions, just stamped the seal with bored precision. When I returned to the office, I printed 2 copies, one for my folder, one sealed in an envelope labeled "to be opened in case of audit discrepancies." I didn't rant. I didn't warn anyone. I'd done that already. My emails, my calls, my memos, all ignored. But I wasn't trying to be heard anymore. I was making myself undeniable. Marcus thought cutting my access meant cutting my control. He didn't understand that control doesn't live in permissions. It lives in proof. And paper. Notarized, timestamped, bulletproof paper, was about to be the loudest thing in the room. By Thursday morning, the office was humming with false energy, the kind that comes before a fall. Marcus strutted through the open floor like he owned the place, tossing motivational quotes at interns as if he were filming a LinkedIn commercial. "Simplify or die," he called out, double-tapping his own reflection in the glass wall of the conference room. I kept my head down, quietly updating a risk control checklist that no one had asked for, but that I knew would save lives, or at least reputations. By noon, I noticed something else. My name had been quietly removed from the recurring finance sync invite. No explanation. Just gone. It wasn't incompetence. It was precision. Marcus was rewriting history in real time, shrinking my footprint one file, one thread at a time. When the CFO, David, started parroting Marcus's catchphrases, lean workflow, velocity over bureaucracy, I knew the infection had spread. The worst part? They actually believed him. That afternoon, payroll pinged again. "Hi, Rachel. Quick clarification. Could you start tracking break times as well?" Break times? Like I was a temp clocking hours at a deli counter. My jaw tightened. I typed a polite, "Sure thing," then logged every second of the insult. Every time I blinked, I recorded it. And that evening, I drove back to the UPS store. Linda, the notary, looked up from her counter with the faintest smirk. "Back again?" she asked. "Seems like you're working overtime." "Just staying compliant," I replied. The second memo was sharper. I named the vendors: Iron Peak Systems, Marlowe Tech, and Vector Logistics. 3 contracts Marcus's team had optimized by copying Q2's template wholesale. I attached screenshots showing identical formulas, unchanged payment categories, and the edit logs with Marcus's initials beside each adjustment. One mistagged line had shifted $692,000 from operational to capital expenses, enough to push us past the threshold by 4.6%. That number wasn't theory. It was a tripwire. I cited the clause again, Section 5.2b of the lender agreement. Any capital increase exceeding 18% required written disclosure prior to fund drawdown. Failure to do so constituted breach. We were sitting at 22.6%. I even added the math, printed in bold, because I knew someone would try to call it subjective. Then I stapled the Slack meme Marcus had posted, the compliance Cassandra one, to the back of the memo. Context matters. When I slid the envelope into my desk drawer, labeled internal, prepared in anticipation of external inquiry, I didn't feel satisfaction. Just certainty. The kind that settles in your bones when you know a train wreck is inevitable, and all you can do is document the debris. Friday came with a cruel kind of irony. The company newsletter featured Marcus in a glossy photo beside the headline, "Driving Modernization: How One Leader Streamlined Compliance." I stared at it over my morning coffee until the words blurred. Streamlined compliance. That was one way to describe cutting every safety brake on a moving train. By the following week, whispers started. People mentioned a new audit structure in Slack threads I couldn't see. A junior analyst, Amber, accidentally forwarded me a message meant for Marcus's pod. "Rachel's out of the reporting loop now, right?" Followed by a thumbs-up reaction. I didn't reply. I saved it. Another page in the growing archive. Then came the final blow. The Q3 ledger folder reappeared in the shared drive, renamed Final Audit Prep, M. Thompson V3. I clicked it open. Read only. Of course. No variance notes, no cross-checks, just one green cell on the Compliance tab. Completed? Completed by who? Not me. Marcus had amputated every safeguard and called it progress. I leaned back, watching the cursor blink on the screen like a heartbeat fading out. This wasn't negligence anymore. It was intent. He wasn't managing risk. He was burying it. I didn't send an angry email, didn't raise my voice. I just printed the entire sheet, all 342 lines of it, and placed it neatly into a folder marked Archive, pending review. Marcus believed silence meant surrender. What he didn't realize was that silence in the right hands becomes strategy. I wasn't fighting him in meetings anymore. I was letting him hang himself with his own certification. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd erased me. What he'd actually done was sign his name at the bottom of a $5 million time bomb, one I'd already stamped, sealed, and tucked 10 feet from legal's door. The following Monday started with forced cheer. The office had that synthetic buzz, pastries in the kitchen, executives in suits, fake laughter bouncing off glass walls. It was financial closeout day, and everyone acted like they were on the brink of a promotion. Everyone except me. My name wasn't on the calendar invite. No meeting link, no FYI, nothing. Just silence. I learned the meeting was happening only because Amber, bless her conflicted conscience, sent me a DM. Hey, do you still want access to the updated projections? Not sure if you're looped in anymore. That was how I found out they'd moved the final prep into Marcus's efficiency pod. Handpicked, loyal, uninformed. I clicked into the shared drive out of reflex. A new folder had appeared. Q3 Audit Finals, Thompson V3. Permissions, view only. The spreadsheet was spotless, unnaturally so. No variance notes, no color-coded vendor tags, no comments in the margins. Just perfectly aligned columns and a single checkmark in the compliance tab that read, Complete. Whoever reviewed it hadn't worked a real audit in their life. The absence of red flags was the biggest red flag of all. I stared at it for a long minute, then checked the metadata. Last modified, Sunday, 10:43 p.m. By M. Thompson. Of course, Marcus had stayed late, doctoring the numbers alone, polishing the narrative he wanted the board to see. Streamlining, he called it. I called it sabotage wrapped in Excel. The next morning, my inbox chimed with another message from HR. Hi, Rachel. As part of our alignment initiative, could you start logging deliverables weekly in a shared tracker? Weekly? It was laughable. I'd designed that very process 2 years earlier, the same one Marcus had scrapped because it was too bureaucratic. Now they were resurrecting it as a pretext to monitor me. I typed back one line. Absolutely, tracking begins today. I kept my promise. Every task, every timestamp, every alignment meeting that excluded me. Then I printed it all, 3-hole punched the pages, and slid them into a binder labeled Paper Trail, Phase 2. My colleagues thought I was quietly fading into irrelevance. What they didn't see was that I was building a wall of notarized proof high enough to bury an entire department. By Wednesday, Marcus's confidence had inflated to cartoon levels. He strutted around with a venti cold brew like a victory chalice, telling anyone who'd listen that legacy compliance was obsolete. He even quoted a productivity blog in the all hands. Speed is the new safety. I nearly choked on my coffee. That afternoon, during his presentation rehearsal, I stood by the copy machine pretending to collate documents while his voice carried down the hall. This quarter proves that cutting redundant oversight drives velocity, he declared. David, the CFO, laughed a little too loudly. The sound of complicity. At 5:17 p.m., I opened the ledger again. The final version, the one Marcus was set to certify. My read-only access had been left intact, probably by accident. The moment I scrolled past line 300, my pulse started to hammer. There it was. The same 3 vendors, the same misclassified totals, the same dollar amounts from Q2. Not a single updated split or reclassification. He hadn't even changed the internal notes. The comments column still said, reviewed by finance. Except finance hadn't touched it since June. I felt the cold weight of inevitability settle over me. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was math. Immutable, merciless math. Capital expenditures up 22.6%. No disclosure filed. No reconciliation note. A perfect, polished covenant breach. I hit print. Every page, every comment, every hidden column. I added the changelog again, highlighting Marcus's name beside each final edit. Then I walked out, folder in hand, calm as a glacier. The UPS store smelled like toner and old coffee. Linda looked up from her counter and just nodded. No words this time. She flipped through the pages, stamped the seal, and handed them back with her usual dry professionalism. "This for work again?" she asked as she signed the logbook. "Eventually," I said. Back at the office, I slipped the envelope into the compliance archive cabinet. The slot was labeled Pending External Review. I pushed it in until the flap disappeared. 10 feet from legal's office. 10 feet from inevitability. Then I sat back at my desk, smiled through the next meeting, dropped a laughing emoji on Marcus's Slack meme about efficiency culture, and took notes I'd never need to read. He thought he was consolidating power. What he was really doing was tightening the noose and signing his name at the bottom. The morning of the audit review, the office buzzed like a shaken soda can. Everyone pretended to be calm, but you could feel the static in the air, that anxious mix of caffeine and denial. Someone had actually ordered fresh pastries for the kitchen, not the usual day-old muffins. The CFO, David, was pacing outside the boardroom, muttering numbers like prayers. And Marcus? Well, Marcus looked like a man about to win an Oscar. New suit, gleaming tie, and that nauseating air of confidence that always precedes catastrophe. I wasn't invited, of course, but I knew better than to miss the show. I stood just outside the conference room, quiet as a ghost. From where I stood, I could hear Marcus pitching his fantasy to the executive team. "What we've achieved this quarter is nothing short of transformation," he said, pacing like a TED Talk reject. "We eliminated redundancy, collapsed legacy reconciliation, and reduced compliance latency by 37%. Compliance latency. He made it sound like a traffic report. David chuckled. Didn't think we could cut that much fat without cutting bone. Marcus laughed back. Just takes fresh eyes. They ate it up. The applause was polite but real. Nobody wanted to be the first to question the golden boy. Believing in him meant believing the company was still innovative, still ahead. Momentum was easier than truth. When the meeting ended, Marcus strutted past my desk, Starbucks cup in hand, tie loosened, grin wide. "You missed a hell of a presentation, Rachel," he said, like he was tossing breadcrumbs to a servant. "I'm sure it was illuminating." "Oh, it was," he replied, winking. "Footnotes don't matter anymore." I wanted to throw my stapler at him. Instead, I just smiled. "You signed the certification?" "Hot off the printer," he said proudly, tapping the lid of his cup. "Streamlined and sealed." Then he added, "Take the rest of the day off, boss lady." He turned, whistling down the hall like he'd just landed a NASA contract. But that one sentence, "You signed the certification," was all I needed. His ink was on it now. Every misclassified dollar, every recycled template, every arrogant shortcut. It was official. I waited 2 days. When the audit team arrived, the mood shifted from smug to suffocating. The lead auditor was a man named Stephen Grant, tall, weathered, the kind of tired that comes from too many red-eye flights and too few honest spreadsheets. His suit was wrinkled, his briefcase scuffed, but his eyes were scalpel sharp, the kind of man who could find a lie just by listening to silence. "Stephen Grant," he said, shaking hands around the table without smiling. "We'll start with your Q3 vendor ledger and certification package." Marcus leapt up like an overexcited puppy. "You're going to love what we've done, Stephen. We've modernized the entire structure, streamlined the reconciliation process, simplified categorizations." "Let's just start with the ledger," Stephen interrupted. His tone wasn't rude. It was surgical. I slipped quietly into a chair in the back corner. Advisory presence, as my official title allowed. Technically, I wasn't required to speak. Perfect. I opened my notebook, uncapped my pen, and waited. Marcus and his analysts shuffled papers nervously as Stephen logged into the shared audit folder. Vendor summary, Stephen said flatly. August and September. Of course, Marcus replied. We consolidated classifications based on historical trend lines to ensure continuity. Just the ledger, Stephen repeated. Marcus faltered. Right. He turned to his analysts. Pull up the CapEx report. While they fumbled, I reached into my bag and slid a sealed envelope across the table towards Stephen. Labeled in black Sharpie, to be opened if audit discrepancies arise. His eyes flicked down, then back to me. He didn't open it, not yet. He just placed it beside his laptop like a loaded weapon. The room fell into uneasy quiet. Mouse clicks. Pages rustling. Marcus trying to fill the silence with nervous chatter. Our categorization logic is airtight, he said, half laughing. We've been more rigorous than ever. Stephen scrolled deeper into the file. His finger paused on the trackpad. Tap, tap, tap. Then it stopped. Line 342, he said quietly. Vendor, Iron Peak Systems, classified as capital expenditure. Marcus nodded too quickly. Correct. CapEx services for Q3E expansion. Stephen's eyes didn't move. Line 388. Same vendor, separate department, also CapEx. Marcus blinked. Right. They split scope across. Stephen opened a binder, flipped to a marked page, and ran his finger down the text. Section 52B. Capital expenditures exceeding 18% quarter over quarter require disclosure prior to fund drawdown. He looked up. Was disclosure filed? Marcus smiled thinly. Well, that would fall under legal, or the CFO, technically. Was disclosure filed? Stephen repeated. Silence. David cleared his throat but said nothing. The controller stared at her notes like they might catch fire. Stephen's hand moved toward the envelope. The air in the room went still. He opened it slowly. The first page bore the notary seal. His eyes scanned the memo, then the attachments, then the Slack printout stapled at the back. His breathing changed, not louder, just slower. He looked up at Marcus. Who prepared this? Marcus let out a strained laugh, the kind people use when their brain is searching for an escape route that doesn't exist. What memo? He said, eyes darting toward David like a student caught cheating during finals. The room froze. I raised my hand slowly. I did, I said. The sound of my own voice cut through the air like a pin popping a balloon. Stephen turned toward me, his expression unreadable, pen hovering midair. You prepared this? He asked. Yes, I said evenly. In August. It outlines vendor misclassifications under Marcus's new schema that violate Section 5.2b of our lending agreement. Marcus blinked at me, the smirk gone from his face. You never sent that to me. No, I replied, calm as glass. I filed it in the compliance archive labeled, to be opened if audit discrepancies arise. He scoffed, the sound brittle. Why wouldn't you escalate it properly? I did, I said. During the July prep call, you told me we weren't here to debate hypotheticals. The CFO shifted uncomfortably. The controller looked down. Stephen didn't move. He simply flipped to the second page of my memo, eyes scanning the figures. This line, he said, tapping with the pen, $692,000 reclassified from operational to capital. Originally tagged as operational in Q2? Correct, I replied. Those invoices were split across departments after July and should have remained OPX. Marcus tried to recover, his voice rising. It's not that simple. The definitions are fluid. Context matters. Stephen's head tilted slightly. Not when your capital ratio jumps 22.6% without disclosure. His tone was cool, lethal. Legal tried to interject. We may need to confer with counsel before. But Stephen didn't even look their way. You should, he said flatly, after I've notified your lender's compliance desk. That sentence hit like a gavel. Marcus stammered. This is a misunderstanding. These were legacy entries. The model was reused from Q2 to maintain consistency. Reused? Stephen repeated, one eyebrow lifting. So, you duplicated the previous quarter's categorization framework without adjusting for vendor scope changes? Marcus hesitated. We built on it. It's industry standard. Stephen tapped his pen against the table. Once. Twice. Did the vendor scopes change? The silence stretched until it cracked. Marcus exhaled shakily. Procurement would know more about that. Stephen's gaze didn't shift. Because this misclassification qualifies as a liquidity threshold breach under Section 5.2. The words landed like hammer blows. The CFO whispered, "Oh, God," under his breath. Not blasphemy, just resignation. Legal's typing grew frantic. The analysts were motionless, pale as printer paper. Everyone could see it now. The cliff edge they'd been speeding toward with Marcus at the wheel. Stephen looked back at me. You documented this 10 days before certification? Yes. Were you told not to escalate further? No, I said quietly. I was removed from the ledger workflow. Marcus snapped. Because you were overstepping. Stephen's eyes flicked to him. Don't. Just one word. Sharp enough to slice air. Marcus shut his mouth. CFO. Stephen continued calmly. When was the last time legal disclosed covenant risk to the lender? David hesitated, voice thin. Not since Q2. Stephen nodded once. You'll want to fix that today. Marcus's confidence drained visibly. The flush crept up his neck, his shoulders slumped. He glanced at the report as if it might morph into a different document if he stared hard enough. Can't we just restate it? He said desperately. We can revise, amend the filing. No, Stephen interrupted. This isn't optics. It's exposure. He closed the folder with deliberate finality and tucked my memo neatly inside. I'll be notifying your lender's audit liaison within the hour. All drawdown activities must be frozen until this is resolved. No one breathed. Marcus looked like he'd swallowed glass. Legal muttered something about crisis protocol. David stared at the table, eyes hollow. I just sat there, hands folded, expression neutral. Not smug, not angry, just finished. Stephen stood. We'll resume once your internal counsel completes an incident report, he said, buttoning his jacket. Then he walked out without a word to anyone. The door clicked shut. Crisp. Final. Like a courtroom verdict. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then the noise started. Whispers. Frantic typing. Paper shuffling. Marcus turned to the CFO, voice cracking. We can spin this. Call it a clerical error. Refile the report. David snapped. You signed it, Marcus. You certified the numbers. Legal's voice was flat. We have to freeze activity now, or risk escalation. I sat there, still as stone, watching the chaos unfold around me. The same people who'd laughed at my doomsday memos now realizing I'd been the only adult in the room. They didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just about numbers. This was evidence. And Marcus had signed it in ink. No one spoke for several seconds after Stephen left. You could feel the air change, heavy and deliberate, like the room itself understood what had just happened. Then Allison from legal, usually quiet and polite to the point of invisibility, looked up from her laptop and said flatly, "Marcus, we need you to leave the room. No preamble, no soft landing. Just the corporate equivalent of a firing squad." Marcus blinked, as if the words hadn't registered. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice small for the first time since he'd set foot in this company. Allison didn't repeat herself. She just stared. David avoided eye contact, pretending to straighten his papers. The analysts sat motionless, their keyboards untouched. Even the sound of the air conditioner felt intrusive. Marcus stood slowly, like he was moving through thick air. His hands twitched once near his sides, maybe a gesture toward protest, maybe just nerves. "You can't seriously think." "Marcus," Allison interrupted, her tone the calm of someone who has already drafted the termination clause. "Please step outside." He looked at me last, eyes wild and confused, like I'd pulled the rug out from under him. I didn't flinch. He left without another word, his steps echoing down the hallway until the door clicked shut. Allison exhaled quietly, then turned to me. "Rachel," she said, voice steady but drained, "could you walk us through the memo you submitted?" There was no mockery this time, no patronizing smile, just exhaustion, the look of people who finally understand that the iceberg wasn't theoretical. I opened my folder and handed out copies of the memo, each one clean, organized, and time-stamped. "The issue began with vendor payment classifications," I said evenly, "in July. Iron Peak Systems, Marlowe Tech, and Vector Logistics changed scopes across departments. The original Q2 matrix was copied forward without adjustment." David frowned, flipping through the pages. "Copied forward?" "Yes," I said. "Identical formulas, same comment threads, same categories, line by line." I pointed to the printouts. "You'll see Q2's tags here. Green highlights indicate operational expenses. Now compare to Q3. Same amounts, but reclassified as capital expenditures. No reconciliation, no supporting justification." The controller's fingers hovered over the table edge. "That would push us past the threshold. 22.6%, I confirmed. Section 5.2b requires written disclosure for any increase above 18% prior to fund drawdown." "We filed none." David muttered something under his breath, reread the clause twice, then slumped back in his chair. "This triggers the clawback provision," he said finally, his voice low, almost hollow. "Page 4, paragraph 3. I nodded once. It gives the lender authority to rescind drawdowns and demand repayment of funds issued under misrepresented certification. Legal was already typing, eyes darting across screens. "We'll need to notify the lender's compliance counsel before the audit team does," Allison said. "If they hear it from Stephen first, we'll look negligent." The controller winced. "That's at least $5 million, minimum." "Closer to 6, depending on standby facilities," I said. My tone was calm, detached, surgical. The facts were loud enough on their own. No one argued anymore. The room felt like triage, people moving mechanically, damage control in progress. They weren't saving the quarter now. They were trying to save the company's reputation. I watched them scramble, flipping binders they hadn't opened in months, opening templates for incident reports, pulling up risk logs that no one had maintained since Marcus arrived. The sound of clicking keyboards and hushed voices filled the room. I'd spent 6 years building this compliance framework, brick by brick, memo by memo. He tore it apart in 2 months, and now they needed me to rebuild it overnight. "Rachel," Allison said quietly, "we'll need you to lead internal remediation." For the first time that day, I allowed myself a breath. Of course, I said. David ran a hand over his face, looking suddenly older. When the CEO finds out about this, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. We all knew the fallout would reach the top. I gathered the documents, aligned them neatly, and stood. Around me, the executives whispered, "Legal coordinated damage reports," and the analysts stared at their screens like confessionals. They didn't grasp it yet, but the balance of power in that room had already shifted. It wasn't in titles or job descriptions anymore. It was in the paper trail, in the timestamps, the seals, the clauses no one but me had ever bothered to read. Control didn't belong to Marcus. It never had. It belonged to whoever could prove the truth. And my proof had been notarized. The boardroom felt colder than usual the next morning. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere, like the oxygen had been quietly drained out overnight. The long walnut table that usually held half-empty LaCroix cans and scribbled Post-its was stripped bare except for 3 neat stacks of documents, a pitcher of water, and one sealed envelope with a notary stamp gleaming faintly under the fluorescent lights. Stephen Grant, the auditor, sat at the head of the table, jacket off, but posture razor straight. Beside him were Allison from legal and David, the CFO, both looking like they hadn't slept in days. Across from them sat the CEO, stone-faced, his tie knotted too tight, his silence heavy. I stood near the far end of the room, arms folded loosely, the way you stand at a wake for someone you didn't like but respected enough to show up for. Marcus wasn't there. He'd been asked not to attend. The official phrase for your access badge has been disabled. The chair where he used to sit, his self-declared war seat, was empty now, ghosted by fluorescent light. Stephen began without ceremony. By certifying this report, he said, his voice level but weighted, your former director created exposure to a $5 million covenant breach. He tapped the memo with his pen. This document, dated 10 days before certification, demonstrates internal awareness of the risk prior to submission. It carries a valid notary seal and timestamp. He turned to legal. You've confirmed this? Allison nodded once. We have. It aligns with internal correspondence and ledger change logs. Liability rests with the act of certification under known risk. The CEO's fingers drummed once against the table, then stilled. So, we can't claim ignorance. No, Stephen replied. You can't. The silence after that felt thick enough to stand on. The CEO turned his gaze toward me. Not angry, just searching, like a man replaying every conversation he'd ignored. You didn't bring this directly to me, Rachel, he said quietly. Why? I met his eyes. I did, I said. The envelope was the escalation. It was filed under compliance protocol in case of audit discrepancies. The procedure was documented, approved, and ignored. He looked down, jaw tightening. A small nod, the kind you give when a truth lands too late. Understood, he said finally. Stephen began gathering his papers, his tone shifting into administrative precision. I'll be notifying your lender's compliance team within the hour. You'll need to prepare a formal remediation plan by Friday. I suggest internal restructuring to prevent recurrence. He didn't say fire Marcus. He didn't need to. When he left, the sound of the closing door echoed like a verdict. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the CEO exhaled. Not a sigh, but a slow release of years of misplaced trust. David, he said, begin clawback negotiations. Allison, prep lender correspondence. Rachel? He hesitated, measuring his words. I want you to lead compliance through remediation. Full authority. It wasn't a question. It was a command. Yes, sir, I said. The meeting dissolved after that. Quiet, methodical chaos. Legal called crisis management. Finance drafted revised statements. PR wrote placeholder apologies in corporate code. unexpected reporting irregularities. I stayed behind, collecting the leftover papers. The envelope, my envelope, still sat on the table. The notary seal glinted under the recessed lighting, proof that paper still outranked power. The next morning, I came in early. The hallways were dark, the air still heavy with yesterday's damage. On my desk sat a plain white envelope. No logo, no fanfare. Inside were 2 letters. The first, from HR, confirmed Marcus's termination, effective immediately. No exit interview, no farewell post, just deletion. The second was handwritten, from the CEO. Short, precise. Rachel, your integrity saved this company more than we deserve. Effective today. Director of Compliance. I didn't smile, didn't feel triumph, just quiet certainty, the kind that comes when justice doesn't roar, it documents. I took the original memo, the one with the red notary tab, and walked down the hall to the compliance archive, that ancient metal cabinet no one had cared about since Marcus's modernization. Drawer 3, section labeled Quarterly Risk Events. I slid the file inside a fresh folder and wrote on the tab in black ink, Q3, Thompson Breach. Then I locked the drawer. For a long moment, I stood there with my hand on the key, listening to the faint hum of the building. Printers warming up, coffee machines sputtering to life, people returning to business as usual. They'd move on, as they always did. Another quarter, another fire, another hero forgotten. But somewhere in those drawers sat the truth. Notarized, time-stamped, undeniable. Control, I realized, never lived in meetings or titles or the noise of confident men. It lived in the paper trail, and mine was bulletproof.